The warning signs were there long before the first German columns crossed the border. In fact, some of Germany's smartest military minds spent the entire spring of 1941 quietly panicking. They understood something Adolf Hitler refused to accept. The invasion of the Soviet Union looked bold on paper, but the math behind it was terrifying. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a gamble. To the generals who actually studied the terrain, measured the distances, and calculated supply needs, it looked like a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen. They could see the cracks forming months before the first shot, and no matter how many reports they filed, the same uncomfortable truth kept rising to the surface. Germany was about to enter a fight it had no way of finishing quickly, and a fast outcome was the only outcome that could possibly work. That's the part Hitler never understood. He believed sheer willpower and belief could overpower logistics. He thought the Soviet Union would collapse like a rotten building the moment Germany pushed hard enough. But the generals knew better. They knew the Soviet Union was massive beyond imagination, difficult to move across, unpredictable in climate, and capable of absorbing punishment in a way Germany had never faced before. The first major warning came from geography itself. German generals were trained to think in kilometers, how far fuel could stretch, how fast vehicles could move, how many hours infantry could march. They were stunned when they realized the Eastern Front wasn't just large, it was almost infinite. On paper, it looked like a map. In real life, it was a continent. You could defeat an enemy army in the west and still have another 1,000 kilometers of empty land ahead of you before the next major city. And distance wasn't just a number. Distance was fuel, trucks, weather, food, ammunition, spare parts, and time. Germany had just fought a lightning campaign across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where terrain was compact and infrastructure was modern. But the Soviet Union was the opposite. The roads were dirt. The rail gauge was different, towns were far apart, rivers were wide and often had no proper bridges. Everything on the map whispered the same message. This was a battlefield designed to swallow armies whole. In meeting rooms, generals tried to explain this. They argued that Germany didn't have enough trucks and didn't have enough fuel. They pointed out that half the trucks they did have were civilian models built by dozens of different companies, meaning spare parts would be a nightmare. But Hitler dismissed it all. Germany, he believed, had beaten France in 6 weeks. What could the Soviets possibly do? Other warnings came from intelligence. The generals studying Soviet production reports saw something Hitler refused to see. The Soviet Union had more tanks, more planes, and more manpower than Germany expected. True, many of their machines were outdated, but the generals warned that Soviet industry was enormous. Even if Germany destroyed whole armies, the Soviets had factories further east capable of replacing everything. The biggest alarm bell was manpower. Germany was already struggling to replace losses from campaigns in Poland, Norway, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The generals knew that if Barbarossa dragged on, the math became impossible. The Soviet Union had over 170 million people. Germany and its allies had far less. You cannot win a long duel against a nation that can keep replacing its forces long after you can't. Some officers tried to highlight this in subtle ways. Others were more direct. Field Marshal von Rundstedt warned that Germany had no exit strategy. General Halder warned that supply lines would collapse once the army moved too far east. Even General Guderian, who believed in lightning warfare more than anyone, privately admitted the distances in Russia made fast operations nearly impossible to sustain. Then came the climate warnings. German meteorologists and officers who had served on the eastern border warned repeatedly that the climate wasn't just cold in winter, it was brutal enough to stop armies. In peacetime, German equipment struggled in mild winters. In Russia, temperatures could sink to levels that froze engines, shattered fuel lines, and made weapons stiff and unreliable. Lubricants turned to glue. Steel became fragile. Horses, which pulled most of Germany's equipment, would suffer badly. The generals pushed for proper winter clothing and winter oil. They also pushed to shorten the campaign's timeline. They knew that if the invasion wasn't finished before the cold season hit, it was over. But Hitler's timeline was based on faith, not planning. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse in 10 weeks. Problem solved. The generals also understood something deeper. The Soviet Union had been planning for a long war, even if Hitler didn't realize it. They read Soviet speeches. They saw the construction of factories deep inside the interior. They knew the Soviets were building fallback positions, defensive belts, and fortifications far behind the border. They knew the Red Army was reorganizing faster than Germany expected. Some officers argued that the Soviet system was politically fragile but militarily stubborn. Even if Stalin's leadership was chaotic, the Soviet population was accustomed to hardship. They did not give up easily. Germany's leadership believed the Soviet people would revolt the moment the invasion began. The generals understood that was fantasy. Then there was the issue of timing. Germany had invaded France in 1940 with rested troops and full equipment. But by the time Barbarossa began, the Wehrmacht had been fighting non-stop for 2 years. Units needed recovery time, vehicles needed repairs, soldiers needed rest. Instead, they were rushed to the eastern border for the biggest operation in German history. Many officers warned that they were sending in an army that was already exhausted. Fuel was another silent crisis. Petroleum experts told the generals that Germany didn't have enough oil for a long campaign. The Soviet Union supplied some of Germany's oil before the invasion. Once the fighting started, that source vanished. The generals begged Hitler to delay operations until more synthetic fuel plants were ready. Hitler ignored them. He wanted the invasion now, not in 6 months. Supply officers warned that even if Germany captured Soviet oil fields, they wouldn't be able to use them quickly. Facilities would be damaged. Pipes wouldn't match German equipment. The infrastructure needed time. Again, Hitler brushed this off. He believed everything would magically fall into place once victory was achieved. Inside the high command buildings, the tone became more anxious. Some generals started talking in whispers. They didn't argue the war was unwinnable. They argued it was unwinnable with the resources available. They knew Germany needed a much larger supply system, hundreds of thousands more trucks, double the fuel reserves, at least 6 more months of preparation, and a realistic understanding of Soviet resilience. But Hitler's confidence drowned everything out. He believed the Red Army was weak. He believed Stalin's purges had crippled Soviet leadership. He believed the Soviet Union would crack the moment German divisions crossed the border. And so, against the advice of his own staff, he ordered the invasion. The moment Barbarossa began, the general's worst fears became reality. The first problem wasn't even Soviet resistance, it was dust. Deep, thick dust clouds filled the air as German vehicles moved across unpaved roads, clogging engines, choking radiators, and covering everything. Mechanics worked non-stop. Trucks and tanks started breaking down before the Red Army even appeared. When the rains arrived, dust turned into endless mud. Vehicles sank, horses struggled, artillery became impossible to move. German troops watched their supply trucks stall and choke as the roads disappeared beneath rivers of mud. This was in the first few weeks, long before winter. The generals didn't need winter to tell them things were going wrong. They saw it in broken axles, stalled convoys, and fuel shortages. And then there was the Red Army. Hitler was wrong. They didn't collapse. Even when they were outmaneuvered, even when whole divisions were surrounded, the Soviets didn't panic. They kept forming new lines. They kept sending reinforcements. They kept fighting with a stubbornness Germany had never faced before. The generals saw this clearly. The Red Army wasn't weak. It was learning. It was adapting. And it had endless reserves. But the most chilling moment came when the Germans realized how far they still had to go. After months of fighting, They looked at their maps and saw they had only covered a fraction of the Soviet Union. They were deep in enemy territory, supply lines were cracking, trucks were falling apart, and troops were exhausted. And yet Moscow, Leningrad, and the Caucasus were still distant points on the horizon. The distances the generals had warned about were now crushing Germany's momentum. Then the weather shifted. Autumn turned to freezing cold. Engines began to fail, rifles jammed, food froze, horses suffered terribly. Soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find just to stay warm. Winter gear had not been delivered. Hitler had not believed it would be needed, and once again, the generals' warnings became their reality. But even more dangerous than the cold was the speed of Soviet recovery. Soviet factories hundreds of miles east began producing tanks, artillery, and planes at a pace Germany could not match. Entire industrial cities had been moved piece by piece, rebuilt and restarted. It was one of the greatest industrial miracles in history, and the German generals knew it immediately. They were now fighting an enemy capable of replacing losses far faster than Germany could. By winter, the truth was undeniable. Operation Barbarossa had failed not because of one mistake, but because every warning the generals had given was correct. The distances were too large, the climate was too harsh, the Red Army was too resilient, supply lines were too fragile, industry in the east was too strong, and Germany simply didn't have the fuel, manpower, or time to finish the job. The generals didn't say, "I told you so." They didn't dare. But privately, in diaries and quiet conversations, they admitted what they had known since early 1941. The invasion was doomed before it began, not because the soldiers lacked skill, but because the plan itself was fantasy. Barbarossa wasn't just a military operation. It was a collision between reality and wishful thinking, and reality won.